there are a lot of reasons why crafting data into visualizations that resonate with customers and other users is really difficult. First off, data presentation alone isn't enough. In order to make information usable, it has to be presented in a way that connects with people. And oftentimes you have to connect with their, grab their attention, and then also provide enough degrees of freedom to allow flexibility for exploration. Another part that makes it really challenging is that crafting a narrative, again, is challenging when, when you're presenting information, whether it's words or diagrams, and when it's a combination of the both, it just makes it more challenging altogether. When it comes to charts and diagrams, oftentimes you're increasing the data density, and that makes it even harder to create these focal moments that people can gravitate towards. And again, if you don't have those moments, then people don't know what to focus on. When you think about different people who might engage visualizations, you're really talking about really great differences in people's backgrounds. And so they might have different comfort levels with the material. They might have different familiarity with it. Oftentimes you can have a mix of professionals and lay folk, and they might know how to interpret data differently from it. Especially when you're thinking about presenting personal information, people might have very different relationships with their own actions, their own behavior, their data. And so there might even be tension coming from what people might unearth in the information. And relying on data alone can also be problematic because people have anxiety when it comes to information and data and numbers. 5 to 7% of people have dyscalculia, and they can't necessarily make sense of data in typical ways. And people have math anxiety is pretty pervasive in America as just a cultural issue. People shy away from doing math. On top of that, people have trouble seeing. So 13% of adult Americans report having issues, and that's even when they're wearing corrective lenses, let alone if they're blind. So I bring this all up because there are a lot of reasons why creating data or crafting data into visualizations can be challenging. What I really want to do is provide some methods in order to break things down in ways that make sense to as many users as possible. Because in the end, even when there are trends in data, data never speaks for itself. And so we need to do that work. So in some recent work I did, the goal was to structure data in meaningful ways. And in our work, what we were able to find is that breaking it down provided a means to ensure we were able to communicate with our viewers. And so we had a template that broke down into 4 basic elements. We had the focus, so what we really wanted to share in the data, some context in order to provide the background that made sense of it. And then we had to actually explain what the data was. So we were able to lead with the focus of that insight, but we needed to really support it with both numbers and the visual evidence in order to provide the full story. And this is a pattern that you can see across different interfaces. So here is an example from LinkedIn. Here you can see that they had the focus of how many profile views there were. They provided some context, some change from week over week. And they had a graphic that provided the visual evidence that allowed someone to explore further. There's some questions of whether or not they actually provided data in there as well in a way. On your own, it might be hard to parse exactly what the changes are from day to day. Another example of structured data here is from New York Times. Here you can see how they also provided focus. Here, the paragraph starts with Sanders leads in early states. Here, since it was supported by an article, it's punctuating an article, the context is highly textual. But the diagram that supports it, the data viz, does provide that data and that visual evidence, although it doesn't summarize it very clearly for someone who might have difficulty parsing information. So those examples were pretty discrete, but this is definitely a pattern that can be extended. And especially once someone begins exploring data, oftentimes, answers raise more questions. So here you can see how someone digging deeper into data can go in further. One thing that we were able to do when crafting our narratives in recent work was to have dynamic introductions that that allowed us to provide that focus and make it very specific. So what we were able to do is point out trends, gaps. We were able to highlight the anomalies in the data in order to drive someone's attention. And again, for people who are less comfortable exploring data, this provide really handy to kind of drive someone into and to explore further. And so in a medication adherence app, we had multiple variations of titles for charts. And so depending on your performance over the course of a week, we were able to highlight different information. And so that could be everything from you took every dose in each time of day, or whether you missed a certain number of doses. Some of the other things that we were able to share was if you were having trouble with certain times of day, we were able to highlight those, again, in order to drive people's attention into what mattered most in the information. So here you can see some examples of the charts that we were working with, and some of those titles in C2 describing here from pie charts or bar charts, information that mattered for the patients to see. Another challenge, though, is that not everyone's cited. And so when you are presenting visual data, there are analogs for people who need oral presentation. And one of the things that was helpful is to think about how someone using a screen reader is going to linearly explore that information. And one of the ways that we're able to kind of break it down for ourselves is to do it as one would in a here. What you're seeing is an Excel spreadsheet that would be like a copy deck, and what it really does is help you figure out analogs for the different parts of a chart. So here we start off reading the overview and their screen reader text to the right of how we would be able to present that. And then even breaking down what's on the x-axis versus what's read for each bar. That's typically how charts are broken down with screen readers. And this allowed us to figure out how someone would be actually making sense of the information if they had to wade through it using that kind of technology. The chart below reflects a different visualization. One of the interesting parts of this is that a lot of the copy from the legend itself was sufficient to present the entire visualization. So for a pie chart, for instance, when you're breaking down percentages, that's something that can very easily translate to text. And so as a result, we didn't have to provide ARIA copy for for the screen reader to digest. When you have a screen reader and you're trying to scan content, so let's say you were trying to read this chart, as you would, as a sighted user would take a look at the chart and either make heads or tails of it or decide it's not worth their time. For this, maybe they would read the title and the context and say 65 potential missed doses of 84. Okay, that makes sense to me. I don't really need to dive into it any deeper. And so someone who wasn't interested would want to skip that visualization or would just scan past it. But if you have a screen reader, it's really difficult. You basically go head deep into it, and you're kind of overwhelmed by that data, and you basically have to wait it out. And so what we were able to do is use kind of almost like jump links in order to allow folks using screen readers to skip data that they didn't need to explore further. So here, if you understood a trend and it was sufficient for your purposes, you could skip over all the evidence that didn't matter to explore further. And you can, of course, these were stacked charts, so you'd be able to spend your time on something that mattered more. Another thing that's kind of interesting to think about is how to even refer to the charts for people who are visually impaired. If they're not going to see, for instance, pie charts, do we even call them pie charts? And we decided to, because obviously the idea of a pie is not just visual, but it's a tasty analog too. And so we were able to use the concept of fractions in that way. And so, so even these are questions that kind of come up when thinking about who the audience is and what their background is and what their abilities are. And finally, I just wanted to go to the most obvious thing that kind of comes up when thinking about abilities and vision issues, which is color blindness. It's really challenging ensuring that charts make sense when you have competing interests. So here, when we were designing, we experimented with lots of different options, and it did require using simulations in order to evaluate which was best. The competing approaches included whether or not it was compliant with our visual design standards in terms of our brand standards, but also that there was enough contrast to actually make sense of the information. So there's a lot of iterative design in this. And you can see that depending on the type of color blindness, charts really look differently to users. And so, so this is kind of like the final pass that we needed to do in order to make sure that the charts really made sense. So that was all I wanted to share today. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Any questions for Ben? I have one. You showed a chart. It was the scan reader, and you had 3 colors, sort of an aqua red and another. What did those colors signify?
Yeah, I can go back there if you'd like. What we were looking at is patient adherence. And so we were looking at what we had broken down as people who are tracking their adherence. So the interesting thing about tracking is when it's patient reported information, patients aren't always good at reporting. And so the colors, I think, were that you had taken it, that you marked things as taken, you'd mark them as skipped, or you had not marked them at all. And so one of the challenges there, conceptually, that we had to validate through usability testing, or actually comprehension testing, was whether or not people understood that the sum of their lack of adherence was not tracking as well as tracking that they hadn't taken things. So that itself is a little math problem. Not everyone connects with that. And so you might be really good at tracking that you are bad at taking your medication, but that doesn't get you better health outcomes. And so again, this is where kind of the math alone doesn't tell the whole story. There really has to be added levels of insight here, about adherence.
Any other questions?
I'll keep an eye on the chat, but I have a follow-up for you as well, Ben.
Yeah.
I was really curious about this process of coming up with captions or descriptions for the charts. And two pieces for this was, one, is there a scenario where none of the captions apply to the current data? And secondly, what was the process like of coming up with those captions or templates?
Yeah, I mean, I think you saw the charts were not the most elaborate of charts, and so it was since it was constrained in that way, it was a lot easier to come up with captions. I think the hard part, no matter what, is coming up with captions that still provide some value. So even if you don't want to discourage people. So in these situations, we're talking about people tracking their own behavior. You don't want to discourage people from providing more data because they have bad, tracking behaviors. And so, there was always this, tension between what do you want to share in the data and what do you want to provide to drive better, tracking behavior. It's kind of a unique circumstance. Not all, user-generated data has its own issues. Patient tracking has its own problems. And then it's not even like fun tracking, like people, Strava, that's fun. People tracking their health information, right on, right? That's a hobby. No one really says tracking my health data is my hobby, or very, very few. So there was definitely some crafting for that. I think that, what we found is that you could be more specific about successes than about failures. So we got more abstract as things may have gone more haywire. And I think that kind of makes sense as well. Like when there are breakdowns, oftentimes they come all at once, right? So it's not like one thing going wrong. Oftentimes it's hard to identify what the sole source of is. It could be bad data. It could be just poor performance. And so oftentimes it's easier to identify successes.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.